So what happens when a shadow war, one that's been going on for years, suddenly bursts out into the open, escalating almost daily, drawing in the big global players?
Yeah, it's a really volatile situation.
Exactly. Today, we're diving into one of the most urgent and, frankly, complex geopolitical hotspots right now, the escalating Israel-Iran conflict.
Hmm.
Now, you've given us a whole stack of essential sources, expert analyses, reports on cyber warfare, potential U.S. involvement, even deep dives into the history behind it all.
A lot to unpack there.
Definitely. So our mission today is to pull out the key insights, the crucial nuggets of knowledge from all this material. We want to help you navigate this complex web of, missile strikes, digital battles, diplomatic moves.
And try to make sense of it all.
Right. We'll uncover the surprising facts, the insights you really need to be properly informed, all while respecting your time. It's not simple, this story.
Far from it.
But by the end, you should have a much clearer picture of the stakes,
Oh.
who the key players really are, and maybe what the potential paths forward might look like.
Hopefully, yeah.
Okay, let's get into it. The headlines are just packed with military actions. What's the latest on the ground, especially since, say, June 12th? What kind of strikes are we actually seeing?
Well, what's really noticeable is, I'd say, the intensity and the precision of the Israeli strikes. Reports indicate the Israeli Air Force has targeted some quite significant Iranian military infrastructure.
Like what specifically?
We're talking about the Shahid Soltani garrison. That's a key IRGC site, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps for missile storage and production. Shahab 3, Qiyam, Fateh, fake ballistic missiles. Important stuff.
Okay, so hitting their missile capabilities hard.
Exactly. And also the IRGC Ground Forces 29th Nabi Akram Operational Division and the Parchin Military Complex. That's been hit multiple times, apparently.
Multiple times on Parchin. That seems deliberate. More than just a single hit. What does that kind of focus maybe tell us about Israel's strategy here?
Yeah, I think you're right. It strongly suggests a sustained effort, probably aimed squarely at degrading Iran's ballistic missile capabilities, trying to reduce that long-range threat.
Makes sense. And what about Iran's response? Are they hitting back with the same kind of precision?
Well, what we're seeing from Iran is more about volume. Since June 12th, reports say Iran launched something like 1,000 drones towards Israel.
1,000. That's a huge number.
It is. But interestingly, only about 200 were actually intercepted in Israeli airspace. The other 800, they just didn't enter, maybe fell short, maybe dealt with earlier.
So not very effective in terms of actually reaching targets then.
Seems that way for the drones, yeah. But they've also kept up their ballistic missile campaign. The barrages seem to be getting bigger, actually. There was one around June 19th with about 30 missiles.
30 in one go.
Yeah.
Even after Israel claims they've taken out a lot of launchers.
Exactly. Despite Israeli claims of destroying, maybe half to two-thirds of Iran's missile launchers, these bigger barrages are still happening.
Okay, so we've got Israeli precision strikes on one side, Iranian high volume, maybe less successful responses on the other. But like you said, there's more to it than just missiles and drones, isn't there? This whole online conflict theater.
Oh, absolutely. That's a whole other battlefield. And it's really heating up, too.
Yeah, this is where it gets fascinating for me. What's happening in the cyber realm?
Well, both sides have pretty formidable cyber capabilities, let's be clear. It's a constant back and forth. Recently, actors linked to Israel, specifically a group called Gonjesko Daram,
Which means?
Predatory Sparrow. They claimed responsibility for infiltrating Iran's state-owned bank SIPA back on June 17th.
Infiltrating a bank. What did they do?
They claimed they destroyed data and caused pretty widespread service outages. And this group, Predatory Sparrow, they have a history. They've been linked to previous attacks that caused actual physical disruption in Iran, sabotaging steel plants, railways, even gas stations.
Wow. Okay. Physical disruption from a cyber attack.
Yeah.
That's a serious escalation, isn't it?
It absolutely is. It blurs the lines significantly.
And Iran's response in cyberspace, are they matching that kind of physical disruption capability?
Not quite in the same way, at least not based on recent reports. Iran's state-sponsored groups, like APT-34, also known as Oil Rig, and APT-35, or Charming Kitten.
They have these cool names, don't they?
They do. They've historically targeted Israeli infrastructure, things like water systems, transportation control. But more recently, their response is described as aggressive, but mostly psychological.
Psychological, what does that look like?
Think waves of phishing emails trying to steal credentials, DDoS attacks, distributed denial of service, trying to knock websites offline, and also, quite disturbingly, sending alarming text messages to Israeli civilians.
What kind of messages?
False warnings, things like imminent fuel shortages or impending terror bombings, really designed just to sow panic and confusion.
So less about breaking physical things, more about breaking public morale.
Exactly. We've also seen claims of DDoS attacks from various hacktivist groups like Arabian Ghosts, Moroccan Black Cyber Army, and another group, Daynet, even issued warnings directly to the United States.
Okay, so it's a real mix. Israel-linked actors showing they can cause physical damage via cyber, while Iran focuses more on that psychological disruption.
Yeah.
It really is a multi-front war.
Definitely.
Right, let's shift gears a bit. The elephant in the room, the United States. That sources strongly suggest the U.S. isn't just sitting on the sidelines watching this. What's the latest on potential U.S. involvement?
Yeah, this is obviously a huge question. The U.S. is actively weighing its options, and the stakes are incredibly high. There were reports from unspecified U.S. officials around June 19th suggesting President Trump has actually approved attack plans for Iran.
Approved plans. Does that mean an attack is imminent?
Not necessarily. The report said he's holding off on a final decision for potentially up to 2 weeks, apparently hoping Iran might accept some kind of deal in the meantime.
A deal. And what would the U.S. target if it did strike?
The specific target mentioned in those reports was the Fordo fuel enrichment plant. It's a key nuclear site.
Right.
The stated U.S. aims seem to be, 1, ensuring any strike is absolutely necessary, 2, avoiding a long, drawn-out war, and 3, effectively destroying Iran's nuclear program capability. We're also seeing reports of military assets being moved into the Middle East to provide, quote, more options.
More options. That phrase always makes you pause, doesn't it? So, if a strike happened, say, just on Fordo, targeting the nuclear program specifically, what do the experts think? Could a conflict like that actually be contained?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The political side is huge. One expert viewpoint suggests that, yes, a war might be contained if the strike is very clearly and solely about Iran's nuclear weapons capability, limited to sites like Fordo.
There's always a but.
The but is if the U.S. expands its targets, maybe starts hitting things with an eye towards, say, regime change. If that happens, Iran's leaders might feel cornered, like they have nothing left to lose. And that could lead to a much wider, more dangerous, unpredictable response.
Right, that calculation changes completely.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that potential Iranian retaliation if the U.S. does get involved more directly, especially with those broader strikes you mentioned. What could that look like?
Yeah, this is a really serious concern in the analysis we looked at. Experts predict that a wider U.S. strike could trigger Iran to lash out regionally. They might target oil facilities belonging to U.S. allies, friends in the region.
Which would send oil prices
Through the roof, most likely.
Yeah.
They could also potentially try to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, a critical waterway for global oil shipments.
Okay, massive economic disruption. What about militarily? Could Iran retaliate directly against U.S. forces?
Right now, the assessment seems to be that Iran's conventional military leadership is decimated, is the word used in one source, and their air defenses are compromised after the Israeli strikes. So the thinking is they're in no shape to retaliate today in a big conventional military way.
Another but.
They have long memories. That's a recurring theme. Once the immediate conflict, the dust settles, they are very likely to fall back on what they know. Terrorism, asymmetrical warfare, using their proxy groups across the region.
So targeting softer targets.
Exactly. Targeting American embassies, maybe tourists, military bases, using groups they support to do the work. This could easily trigger a really nasty cycle of strikes and counterstrikes, a tit-for-tat that just keeps escalating.
And we're already seeing threats along those lines from Iranian-backed groups, right?
Oh, absolutely. The axis of resistance, as they call themselves, they're issuing very clear warnings. The spokesperson for Kataib Hezbollah, that's a prominent Iranian-backed militia in Iraq, threatened just on June 19th that any U.S. participation in strikes would trigger attacks on U.S. bases throughout the region.
Not just bases.
No, also the closure of strategic waterways. They explicitly mentioned the Strait of Hormuz again, the Bab al-Mandab Strait, and Red Sea ports. And U.S. intelligence seems to corroborate this, indicating Iran has already prepared missiles specifically to hit U.S. bases if the U.S. joins an air campaign against them.
So these aren't just empty threats. There seems to be preparation behind them.
That's the assessment, yeah. It's being taken very seriously.
Okay, so the regional implications are huge. What about back home in the U.S.? How is this potential involvement playing out domestically?
Well, you have the official statements. The U.S. press secretary said the administration is, quote, prepared and ready to defend American interests and assets, not just in the region, but here on our homeland. So, acknowledging a potential domestic threat, too.
But is everyone on board with potential military action?
No, definitely not.
Hmm.
There's significant political tension bubbling up. You have lawmakers trying to pass legislation to limit the president's war powers, trying to ensure Congress has a say, and prominent figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, publicly opposing the U.S. getting drawn into another war in the Middle East.
So debate and concern.
Yeah, lots of public discussion around these, hypotheticals, as the administration might call them, but it highlights deep public and political concerns about transparency, accountability, and the potential costs of another conflict.
That domestic angle is definitely crucial. Okay, let's zoom out a bit further. How are other major global powers reacting to all this? Russia, China. What does this escalation mean for Iran's standing on the world stage?
Right. The bigger geopolitical picture, Russia, maybe unsurprisingly, has strongly condemned the Israeli strikes. They're accusing Israel of unprovoked military strikes and blaming the West for anti-Iran hysteria. They're calling for diplomatic solutions.
It's familiar.
It does, doesn't it? Very similar rhetoric to what they use regarding Ukraine. And here's a crucial point from the sources. Russia actually depends quite heavily on Iran right now for armed drones, other military assistance for their war in Ukraine.
So what does that dependence mean for the nuclear issue?
It means Moscow probably isn't going to lift a finger to help prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. In fact, some analysts suggest the Putin regime might even welcome a nuclear-armed Iran. It creates another major headache for the West, a distraction.
Interesting. A potential silver lining for Russia, in a way. What about China?
Iran's support from both China and Russia is definitely growing. These major powers are increasingly shielding Iran from international pressure, propping up its economy. This relationship goes both ways, too. Iran has reportedly supplied ballistic missiles to Russia, which triggered new sanctions from the US, UK, France, and Germany.
So a deepening alignment there. How has Europe reacted more broadly? You mentioned sanctions.
Europe's stance towards Iran has really hardened, especially since 2022. Several factors driving that. Iran's continued expansion of its nuclear program, the brutal crackdown on the protests back in 2022, and their practice of detaining European and dual citizens, often seen as hostage diplomacy.
Has this hardening stance had an economic impact?
Oh, absolutely. Trade between the European Union and Iran has plummeted, down by about 77% since 2017. That really shows the economic cost of these political tensions.
77%? Wow. That's huge. And what about Iran's neighbors in the Gulf? Saudi Arabia, the UAE. Are they cheering on the pressure against Iran?
Actually, this is another fascinating twist. Even Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, traditionally wary of Iran, have been seeking détente, a reduction of tensions with Tehran recently.
Really? Why?
Part of the analysis suggests it's linked to a perception in the region that the U.S. presence and commitment are maybe less reliable than they used to be. So they're hedging their bets, trying to manage regional tensions themselves through diplomacy with Iran.
A more pragmatic, maybe self-reliant approach from the Gulf states then. Okay, so Iran has these growing ties with Russia and China, but facing pressure from Europe and a complex relationship with its neighbors. What about inside Iran? Despite this external maneuvering, are there signs of internal weakness?
Yes, definitely. The sources paint a picture of a regime that seems deeply worried about internal unrest. For instance, there was a report of a near-total internet blackout across Iran on June 18th. That's usually a sign they're trying to limit information flow and prevent mobilization during sensitive times.
Clamping down on information,
Yeah.
what else?
They've arrested individuals they claim are Mossad spies, and they passed a new law imposing much harsher penalties on anyone caught cooperating with hostile foreign governments. And the definition of cooperation is incredibly broad.
How broad?
It includes things like just sending videos or images to foreign media networks if those images might, quote, weaken public morale or create division. It shows a real sensitivity, maybe even paranoia, about controlling the narrative and suppressing dissent.
A heavy-handed approach indeed. How serious are these internal problems? Are they affecting the regime's stability?
They seem quite serious and multifaceted. The sources talk about a moribund economy hit hard by U.S. sanctions, but also suffering from deep-seated corruption and mismanagement. Inflation is sky high, 40–50%. Unemployment is officially around 10%, but much higher, maybe 40% for educated young people.
That's a recipe for discontent.
Exactly. Living standards are falling. There's a significant brain drain, educated people leaving the country country. Add to that a growing environmental crisis, especially severe water shortages, which worsen economic problems and fuel more unrest.
And are people pushing back?
Yes. The sources mention ongoing daily civil disobedience. Things like women refusing to wear the mandatory hijab in public, anti-regime graffiti, protest art. It's maybe not large-scale organized protest right now, but a constant simmer of defiance.
So this combination of economic hardship, environmental stress, and social defiance,
Yep.
it creates a very fragile internal situation.
Absolutely. And it fundamentally limits the regime's options. On one hand, they might lash out externally to distract from domestic problems, but on the other hand, they're vulnerable to sustained pressure precisely because of these internal fragilities.
A tricky balancing act for them. And amidst all this chaos, internal and external, where does the nuclear program fit? Is it still the central issue?
It definitely remains essential, perhaps the central long-term concern for the international community. Iran has significantly expanded its nuclear program since the U.S. left the deal in 2018, but especially since 2019. They've invested heavily in activities that are sensitive, things that could be used for weapons development.
And they're letting inspectors see everything.
No, that's a major problem. They've reduced cooperation with the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. Inspectors have less access, monitoring is reduced. This has led to what the IAEA calls a lost continuity of knowledge. They just don't have a clear picture of everything Iran is doing.
So do we know if they've decided to actually build a bomb?
Based on the available evidence discussed in the sources, there's no clear indication they've made that final political decision to build a weapon. However, all these technical advances they've made essentially give Tehran the option to move much more quickly towards a weapon if they do decide to. It shrinks the breakout time.
They're keeping the option open, getting closer to the threshold. Have there been any diplomatic efforts recently?
Iranian officials sometimes express interest in negotiations, but their positions haven't really softened. They still reject key U.S. demands, like the idea of zero Iranian uranium enrichment, and they keep adding new demands, like wanting all sanctions lifted, even those unrelated to the nuclear program. So it feels like a bit of a stalemate diplomatically.
Yeah, it seems like the positions are still quite far apart. Okay, to really grasp the depth of this conflict, the sources emphasize looking back at the history. It wasn't always like this between Iran and Israel, was it?
It's a really fascinating history, actually, full of contradictions. People might be surprised. Initially, Iran was very much opposed to Israel's creation. They voted against the UN partition plan for Palestine in 47 and against Israel joining the UN in 49.
Okay, so hostile from the start.
Yes, but then surprisingly, under the Shah, Iran became the second Muslim-majority country, after Turkey, to actually recognize Israel, albeit de facto. And relations improved significantly after 1953, when the CIA helped reinstall the pro-Western Shah. There was cooperation, trade.
So a period of relative normalization, even closeness.
Mhm.
What changed?
The 1979 Iranian Revolution, that completely upended everything. The new Islamic Republic immediately severed ties with Israel. Ayatollah Khomeini declared Israel an enemy.
But even then was the break absolute.
Here's another surprising twist from the history. Even after the revolution, during the brutal Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, there were covert dealings. Israel actually sold weapons to Iran Operation Seashell in 1981, as one example mentioned. Realpolitik trumping ideology, perhaps.
Wow, that is unexpected given the intense hostility today. The rhetoric now is just so stark, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's extreme on both sides, often. Iranian leaders have consistently called for Israel's obliteration. They use terms like cancerous tumor that will disappear from the landscape.
And direct threats, too.
Yes. Claims like Israel will cease to exist if it attacks Iran, or warnings that a conflict could escalate into World War III. Very inflammatory language.
And from the Israeli side.
Israel has also been very clear about its red lines, especially regarding Iran's nuclear program. They've threatened unilateral military action against Iranian nuclear facilities since at least 2003. Former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon famously stated, "Israel, and not only Israel, cannot accept a nuclear Iranis." So the threat of preemptive action has been there for a long time.
So this harsh rhetoric, these threats, they have deep roots. And for Iran's current regime, their view of the U.S. is also central to their ideology, isn't it? The Great Satan narrative.
Absolutely critical to understand this. For the regime, it's not just empty sloganeering. It's rooted in a specific list of historical grievances they constantly cite.
Like what?
The 1953 coup that overthrew a popular prime minister and reinstalled the Shah, decades of U.S. support for the Shah, whom they viewed as an autocratic puppet. They point to his modernization efforts, even things like granting more freedoms to women as Western imposition.
So even modernization was seen negatively.
By the clerical regime, yes, as undermining traditional Islamic values, they also resent the capitulations agreements that gave the U.S. legal jurisdiction over crimes committed by Americans in Iran. Then there's the U.S. siding with Saddam Hussein during the devastating Iran-Iraq War. And critically, the 1988 incident where a U.S. warship shot down an Iranian civilian passenger jet over the Persian Gulf.
Which Iran believes was deliberate.
Yes, they maintain it was intentional. So for the regime, these aren't just historical footnotes. They form this powerful, deeply ingrained narrative of American imperialism, betrayal, and hostility. It fuels their anti-Western stance and their self-image as leaders of a global resistance against the U.S.-led world order.
That's the official narrative, the regime's perspective. But you mentioned earlier the internal situation is complex. Does that extend to public opinion about the U.S. and Israel? Is it uniformly hostile among ordinary Iranians?
No, that's a really important distinction the sources make. While the regime pushes this strong anti-Western, anti-Israel line, there are significant numbers of Iranians, particularly those who oppose the regime, who actually desire future cooperation and friendship with the United States.
Friendship with the great Satan. How does that square?
It partly stems from a different historical memory, a people-to-people friendship. Some Iranians recall positive American influences of educators like Samuel Jordan, who helped build modern education, Presbyterian missionaries who established hospitals and schools, U.S. humanitarian aid efforts, Peace Corps volunteers back in the day.
So a reservoir of goodwill, despite the politics.
Potentially, yes. Polling data mentioned in the sources actually indicates a majority of Iranians would support normalizing relations with the U.S.
But what about Israel? Does that support for normalization extend to Israel?
That's where it differs significantly. The same polling shows that a large majority, something like 67%, still reject the idea of normalizing relations with Israel.
That's a fascinating split. Openness to the U.S., but deep-seated opposition towards Israel remains widespread. It really highlights the layers here, doesn't it? It's not just the regime's view.
Exactly. Public opinion is much more nuanced than the official rhetoric suggests.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've taken a real deep dive into this conflict. The kinetic strikes, the cyber warfare, the historical baggage, the complex geopolitics.
From Israel's targeted operations and Iran's responses to the massive question mark over U.S. involvement and Iran's own internal struggles.
Right. It's incredibly multi-layered with just profound implications regionally and globally. So here's a final thought to leave you with, something to mull over.
Okay.
Despite this incredibly long history of animosity, the really harsh rhetoric, and the current dangerous escalation, the sources consistently point towards Iran facing these significant internal weaknesses. And interestingly, some perspectives suggest that external powers, particularly the U.S., are perhaps seen, even by some within the region, as maybe the only actors capable of eventually brokering some kind of enduring peace deal, however unlikely that seems right now.
An outside force being necessary.
Yeah. So what is that apparent paradox, this deep hostility, coupled with potential fragility and the perceived need for external mediation? What does that reveal of the nature of power, about influence, and maybe about the possibility of unexpected paths to resolution, even when conflicts seem completely intractable? Something to think about as you continue exploring this really complex corner of the world.